Thank you for joining me as I start to get angry at the book God's Not Dead by Rice Broocks, and also review it, critique it, examine it, respond to it from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapter 3 of the book, which is titled Good and Evil Are No Illusions. I'll be honest with you up front, this was a tough one to get through. So let's get started, shall we? Brooks opens this chapter by describing the 2012 Aurora, Colorado mass shooting. That's the one that took place on premiere night of The Dark Knight Rises, when a gunman burst into a movie theater wearing riot gear, essentially, and fired into the crowd, and he murdered 12 people and wounded 48. Now, Brooks cites this as an example of something evil, of a truly evil act. People sometimes describe events like that shooting as surreal because we think that it is strange that these sorts of things occur in real life rather than in the movies where we are used to seeing them, at least most of us, those of us who are fortunate. But Brooks doesn't think surreal is a very good word for it. Surreal is an excellent word, however, for the feeling evoked by reading a book by a Christian apologist that references Batman. I'm just going to put that out there. Anyway, Brooks says, quote, "Sadly, these kinds of acts are gradually becoming more common because of the decreasing presence of the knowledge of God in society." Now, some of you might be thinking what I thought when I first read that passage, claiming a direct causal link between the supposed decline of Christianity in the United States, because, let's be honest, even though Brooks says God, he's talking about the God of Christianity. That's what he means. He means the God of his religion. He's saying the decline of his religion is the reason for the increase in violence. And he's trying to link that with an increase in mass killings like the one in Aurora. And you might think that that's a bold proposition, to say the least. But don't worry. Brooks has evidence to back up his proposition. And it is the only evidence to which an apologist ever ultimately resorts. Quote, "The Apostle Paul knew this." Quote, "Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice." So violence in our society is due to our turning away from God. And we can rely on this as the truth because a guy who never met Jesus, but nonetheless presumes to speak for him because of a vivid hallucination he claims he had, said it was true of some other people in a totally different society in a letter he wrote 2,000 years ago. Seems legit to me. One obvious challenge to this argument would be to point out the many, many, many instances throughout just recent history of self-identifying Christians committing comparable crimes, often for explicitly Christian reasons. I could mention incidents such as the murder of George Tiller in 2009, the shooting at a Unitarian Universalist church in 2008, the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta in 1996, and the Planned Parenthood shootings in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1994, to name just a few. I could bring up the fact that the anti-abortion terrorism movement in the United States, which resulted in the Tiller and Brookline shootings, among many other incidents, is entirely Christian in character. I could look beyond the borders of the United States to cite the Lord's Resistance Army, which operates throughout Central Africa, which identifies itself as Christian and is led by a man, Joseph Kony, who claims to speak for God. I could make that challenge. I could use those examples to suggest that an increase in Christianity or awareness of or knowledge of the Christian God doesn't necessarily mean a decrease in violence. But I suspect I already know what Brooks's answer would be because I've heard it so many times before. The perpetrators of the crimes I just mentioned, despite acting in the name of God and showing every sign of being true believers, were not genuine Christians. Brooks holds his interpretation of Christianity to be the correct interpretation and all contradictory interpretations to be false. In that way, he shows himself to be no different than any of the violent extremists from whom he seeks to distance genuine Christians like himself, or indeed from the zealots of all faiths who seek to please their gods or prophets by spilling the blood of their fellow humans. Ultimately, we're left with fundamentalists arguing over who has better understood the inaudible instructions issued by an invisible God. It is a pointless, unsettlable argument. Anyway, Brooks says that good and evil are not illusory but real. But the problem of why there is evil in the world is not as difficult to solve as the problem of why there is good in the world. Without God, Brooks asserts, there would be not only no good, but there would be no evil. And this is a good thing, if I can tumble over that sentence a bit. This is because God provides us with the standard by which to judge whether things are good or evil. And here, as often throughout this chapter, Brooks cites C.S. Lewis writing in Mere Christianity, where he says that he first disbelieved in God because of all the evil in the world, and then he saw that it was actually an argument for God because he realized, how did I come to realize there were such things as good and evil in the first place? Which I think is kind of a silly argument, but that's the argument that Lewis made, far more eloquently, it must be said, than Brooks makes it here. But before we get into the discussion of good and evil and moral or immoral and how God provides us with the basis for determining these things and what this is all about, Brooks regales us with an anecdote about the time he sat next to a philosophy professor on an airplane. This professor described his religious beliefs, according to Brooks's telling of this, I'm sure, completely true story, as militant atheist. The philosophy professor described himself using that term, militant atheist, and listed among the reasons for his atheism an acceptance of the theory of evolution. Boy, there must be way more atheists out there than we ever thought there were. I mean, the world's airports and train stations and cafes and sidewalks must be teeming with them for apologists to continue running into them like this. And they always seem to be philosophy professors, too. Anyway, Brooks claims that he educated this anonymous philosophy professor on evolution by drawing some illustrations on the back of the airsick bag to prove that the professor's understanding of evolution wasn't very good. And I think we can all agree that Rice Broocks is the ideal instructor on the subject of evolutionary biology. The professor then changed the subject from evolution to more philosophical territory, asking, if there is a God, why is there so much evil in the world? How lucky for Brooks that he just happened to sit down next to the least thoughtful militant atheist philosophy professor in the world. Seriously, I am the furthest thing there is from a philosophy professor, other than Rice Broocks. And even I know that the problem of evil is not a very good argument against the existence of God. I think it's not a bad argument against the benevolence of God, but I don't find it moving at all on the question of God's existence. And am I really supposed to believe that this philosophy professor had given so little thought to his position on this matter? Maybe Rice Broocks could call up Norman Geisler or Frank Turek or Lee Strobel, William Lane Craig, Josh McDowell, Tim Keller, N.T. Wright, or some other apologist whose name he might as well draw out of a fucking hat, because they're all pretty much the same as far as I can tell, and ask them what they talked about with the militant atheist philosophy professors they just so happened to run into on planes or at parties or wherever. Were their justifications for atheism just as ready-made for hoary apologetics tropes as this guy Rice Broocks sat to on the plane? As I was saying, no God, no evil. Brooks explains, quote, you see, without God, evil doesn't really exist. The unbeliever can't describe the world we live in without borrowing the biblical concepts of good and evil. Did you catch that? Good and evil are biblical concepts, and I believe there is some implied exclusivity in that statement. In the last chapter, Brooks accused atheists of trying to lay exclusive claim to the concept of reason so that they could automatically label anyone who disagrees with them as unreasonable. One chapter later, he does exactly the same thing, far more blatantly, presenting good and evil, which are universal concepts present in all human cultures throughout history, throughout the world, in the entirety of our species, as biblical concepts. This would come as a surprise to Zoroaster, who promoted a religious philosophy that included concepts of good and evil before the earliest portions of what would eventually become the Bible had even been fucking written. Not to mention Democritus, Confucius, and ordinary people whose names we will never know from cultures all around the globe whose worldviews included awareness of good and evil, despite them never having heard of the Bible, let alone read it and been influenced by it. Again, as with his silly assertion in the previous chapter that God must exist in order for atheists to not believe in him, Brooks is flirting with presuppositionalism, and he has repeatedly referred to the works of Cornelius Van Til, a very influential presuppositionalist. So perhaps Brooks is more than flirting with presuppositionalism in his theology and his apologetics. He says, in order to say that, you have to borrow from my worldview, which is total apologist, presuppositionalist boilerplate. He is essentially saying, you can't say that something is good and evil because those are mine. You have to borrow those from me. If your defense of your worldview includes the insistence that other people must agree with you before they can even argue with you, that might be a sign that your worldview isn't worth defending. Brooks isn't quite done with that atheist philosophy professor. He says, quote, in the end, this thoughtful atheist said, I raised an excellent point, a concession that happens rarely from the ranks of the militant atheists, but happens quite often among the militant atheists who engage apologists in conversation, I have noticed. Note that the philosophy professor is an idiot who doesn't understand evolution and has terribly underdeveloped reasons for being an atheist, but when he says Brooks's preposterous claim that good and evil are biblical concepts is an excellent point, he becomes thoughtful. What a pathetic, nakedly self-serving joke. At the risk of repeating myself, if defending your worldview requires you to lie about winning arguments with obviously invented straw men, maybe it's not worth defending. Especially if you can't even be bothered to invent a different straw man than every other fucking apologist. Brooks says that not all morals are equally valid. Some groups might consider the neglect of children to be permissible, and others might consider the protection of children to be compulsory, and both cannot be right. Quote, but if there is no God, there couldn't possibly be a transcendent morality that everyone should obey. Good and evil would simply be illusions, man-made and arbitrary. I will give Brooks 1 out of 3. I think morality is man-made. I strongly disagree, however, that because it is man-made, it is either illusory or arbitrary. Brooks is essentially arguing that without a transcendent moral standard, nothing will be ultimately right or wrong. There can be no absolute good or absolute evil. And my response to this is, so? Why should we expect it to be otherwise? And given the reality that we disagree with each other on moral questions all the time, at all levels, from individuals on up to entire nations, what practical difference would the existence of a transcendent moral standard make anyway? Can Rice Broocks prove objectively that a given act is ultimately and transcendently good or evil? The answer is no, he can't, and neither can anyone else. But that's okay, because we don't have to. Let's take the example of child neglect, since Brooks brings that one up. I think neglecting a child or abusing a child in any way is morally reprehensible. It is absolutely unacceptable. It cannot be condoned. That is the moral judgment that I have made. Related to that judgment are my thoughts that it's wrong for the stronger to harm the weaker or to allow harm to befall the weaker if they can prevent it, and that it is wrong to take advantage of people or to allow others to take advantage of people. I didn't come to these moral judgments all by myself. I don't exist in a vacuum. I've been influenced by my parents, by my peers, by my culture, by my own individual experiences, by events in my lifetime, by my sense of empathy, by certain psychological and biological attributes that are the products of evolution. It's possible that someone else, the product of a different upbringing, a different culture, a different experience, has made a different moral judgment. Maybe this person considers the neglect of a child to be morally permissible. Brooks's point is that there is no way that I can claim that my moral judgment is absolutely right and this other person's moral judgment is absolutely wrong. But that's just an appeal to consequences. I don't need to be absolutely right. If I so choose, I can have a discussion with this other person and try to persuade them to adopt my opinion on child neglect, but ultimately, I don't have to care what they think at all. And I certainly don't have to affirm their morality, as Brooks suggests I have to if I accept that morality is man-made. If I see a person abusing a child, it is my morality that compels me to act to protect the child, regardless of whether the abuser considers the act to be moral or not. Morality is both man-made and real. In a sense, morality is like reason. There are differences. The basic principles of reason or logic are axiomatic and inarguable, unlike those of morality, but both are tools that mankind has created to enable us to understand and to make sense of the world that we experience and to guide us in making decisions as we navigate our lives lived in this world. I would never describe reason or logic as being illusory. Logic is very real and very important, and so is morality. It's a human construct, but that doesn't make it imaginary, and that doesn't make it arbitrary. It seems to be just as natural an outgrowth of our species as logic or mathematics. And anyway, even if Brooks did have a good argument for why there must be a transcendent moral standard in order for us to prefer one morality over another, he has no such argument for why we should accept his religion as the means to comprehend and apply that standard. That suggestion, like most of what Brooks has had to say so far, is narcissistic garbage. Next, Brooks turns, as all contemporary apologists eventually must, to the events of September 11, 2001. He says, quote, "If evil has an anniversary, this might be the date. It was on this day that our world changed forever." And keep in mind that the man who wrote those words believes there was a point in history where the God he worships drowned nearly every living thing on planet Earth, and that this was not an evil act. Perhaps his opinion on what the anniversary of evil ought to be should be taken with a grain of salt. Brooks writes about atheists like Sam Harris and Bill Maher, both of whom he seems to have a bit of a hard-on for, who responded to 9/11 by blaming the attacks on religion. Quote, "However, people such as Harris and Maher used the events of that tragic day to call for the end of all religion, demonstrating their own form of irrationality and extremism. Somehow, these people can't tell the difference between a suicide bomber and a Sunday school teacher." Yes, well, depending on how dark-skinned the Sunday school teacher is, neither can many Christians, Rice. So, perhaps you can see about that. Okay. That was a cheap shot, and it felt really good to take, but I apologize. I actually agree that religious fundamentalism is much more to blame for events like 9/11 than religion in general. The problem, as I mentioned before, is that the only major difference between the fundamentalism promoted by Brooks and the fundamentalism promoted by jihadists, as well as Christian terrorists, is that Brooks's version doesn't overtly incite its adherents to violence. And I'm grateful for that, but the absolutist thinking is the same on both sides. So anyway, back to morality. What is the foundation of morality? Brooks says, quote, "Knowing that morality must be grounded in some authority, the skeptic's desperate struggle is to find any alternative other than God. The real issue becomes identifying the basis for morality." Well, first of all, who says morality must be grounded in some authority? And why is God, specifically Brooks's God, the default authority to which we must find alternatives? I missed class the day that was definitively established, I guess. So can I borrow somebody's notes on that, maybe? Can humanity be good without God? Brooks's answer is yes, but only because God has made us to be moral. Quote, "The moral law is written on the heart of every person. If there are things that are wrong, regardless of the country, culture, or context they are committed in, then there is an ultimate law and therefore lawgiver." No. There is an agreement that those things are wrong. That's all there is. That's not evidence that there must be a transcendent moral law and beyond that a lawgiver. And actually, those are two different assumptions. So let me take them one at a time. First, the existence of a moral consensus, which is what Brooks is describing in that quote, is not evidence that there must be an ultimate moral law. Not only are morality itself, and specifically concepts of good and evil, cultural universals, there are specific moral principles that are shared by nearly all human societies. Intolerance of murder, theft, and dishonesty are among these principles. The ubiquity of these principles isn't evidence that there is a transcendent morality. It's evidence that societies which don't share these principles don't survive very long. It's sort of a cultural form of natural selection. It's difficult to imagine a society that condones murder, theft, and lying among its members attaining any significant level of civilization. Humans are a social species. We thrive when we work together. If we can't trust each other and cooperate, we don't get very far. Still on the subject of the ultimate moral law, let's not forget that there are many moral questions which do not have universally agreed upon answers. And there are many moral principles for which we can see the moral consensus growing from generation to generation. Institutionalized slavery, for instance, was once legal all over the world. Today, slavery is almost universally condemned and exists mostly in underground criminal forms. Now, there are still people living in slavery in the world today, far too many. But the moral consensus on slavery has moved dramatically from acceptable to unacceptable in the last couple of centuries. The same is true of rape, women's rights, children's rights, gay and transgender rights, and many other issues of great importance to billions of people. Our moral principles are not written in stone, and we should be very, very grateful for that. Now, what about the moral lawgiver? If a transcendent moral law did exist, what would that necessarily tell us about the existence of a moral lawgiver? Would that lawgiver then have to be there if we determine that there is a transcendent moral law? Well, Brooks says yes, but I think it depends on how we're using the word law. If these hypothetical transcendent moral laws did exist, why should we assume they would be any different than the laws of physics or mathematics or logic? In other words, why shouldn't we expect any objective moral laws to be descriptive rather than prescriptive? The law of non-contradiction doesn't determine that contradictory statements cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. That's a human construct that describes a particular aspect of reality. Why would transcendent moral laws be any different? Human constructs describing aspects of reality that are found to be universally present. Transcendent moral laws would no more be evidence of an almighty lawgiver than are the transcendent laws of physics or logic or mathematics. Brooks references Immanuel Kant's concept of the categorical imperative, and he relates that to the Golden Rule, as expressed by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And Brooks sneers at atheists who he accuses of trying to both affirm and downplay the Golden Rule. Well, Brooks is confused. Atheists don't downplay the importance of the Golden Rule. They downplay the importance of Jesus having said it, since it's another one of those moral principles found in nearly all human cultures and is rooted in empathy and the principle of reciprocity, not the philosophy of Jesus. The Golden Rule is actually far more ancient and far more inherent to our species than the less than 2,000-year-old philosophy of Jesus. Broocks turns to what he calls Darwinian ethics, the notion that we should live our lives according to the biological principle of survival of the fittest. Broocks acknowledges that the likes of Richard Dawkins have written and spoken out against modeling human societies after the laws of natural selection, but he still doesn't seem to get it. He says, quote, "This attitude seems to be in direct contrast to the emphatic statements that our purpose is simply to propagate our DNA, and our DNA doesn't care, and the universe doesn't care. We care. That's the point. Our biological purpose might be to propagate our DNA, but we are not merely unconscious vessels for DNA. We are conscious, intelligent, emotional, self-aware beings. We have thoughts, we have culture, we have the ability to comprehend the world and to interact with each other. The fact that all these traits are ultimately products of physics and chemistry rather than something supernatural doesn't rob them of their particular qualities or of their value. Apologists like Broocks often say things like, well, what does it matter what we do? After all, according to evolution, we're just molecules doing things. Well, this is a bit like looking at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, shrugging and saying, what's the big deal? It's just pigment and plaster. I suspect that Rice Broocks would acknowledge a significant difference between a stack of paper and a bottle of ink and a book. If he can grasp that distinction, but not the one between the basic chemical building blocks of a human being and the person, him or herself, I really don't know what the fuck else to tell him. Broocks references Dostoevsky, who wrote that without God, all things are permissible. He accuses atheists of merely asserting their morality without providing a basis for it, in contrast to Broocks, who asserts the basis of his morality without demonstrating it. He once again blames the crimes of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot on atheism, and then he asks why anyone should obey moral commands if they are merely one group's opinion. Because true morality doesn't consist of following commands. This is the problem with insisting that people living in the 21st century continue to take as their moral example people who lived thousands of years ago. Morality, as Broocks damn well knows because he acknowledges the innate moral sense that exists in nearly all of us, is not about obedience to an authority. It's about judgment. It's about making decisions. It's about determining how we ought to treat each other, what our rights and responsibilities are. Following commands is passive. Someone tells you to do something and you do it. Morality is active. We use morality. We make decisions. We make judgments. We ask questions and we search for answers and we struggle. It is active. So anyway, if God is good, why does he allow evil and suffering? Well, for our own good, Rice Broocks says. He created us with free will, and he placed us in a world where we could act as we wanted. But he also gave us instructions for how to live in the best way. Well, we have now reached another trope of apologetics. This is the point when the apologist, who has thus far adopted the persona of a relatively reasonable and civilized person, allows his mask of sanity to slip ever so slightly. Quote, "He gives us not only understanding to harness the physical world around us and the dangers that are present, but also insight into the unseen spiritual world. There are not only evil humans, but evil spirits. Far from a pre-modern view that all disease and mishaps are due to spirits that must be pleased and appeased, there are evil entities that we must be aware of. Jesus dealt first with these evil entities at the beginning of his earthly ministry, Mark 1:21-27. Later, Peter would tell the Gentiles, God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, who went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, Acts 10:38. God's mercy is demonstrated by his becoming a man in Jesus Christ and dealing with our ultimate enemy, who lives in the unseen world. Just in case, You thought Brooks's religious beliefs weren't as primitive and delusional as those folks who handle snakes or attempt to read the future in chicken entrails. There you go. Where did evil come from? Did God create it? Well, no, Brooks says, not exactly. God allowed it, but we created it by using our free will to ignore God's moral law and to disobey his will. It's not God's fault. After all, he didn't create us to be robots that had no choice but to blindly obey him. He created us so that we would have to choose for ourselves to blindly obey him or suffer forever in damnation. Rice turns to the question of whether this is the best of all possible worlds. By his reckoning, there are only 3 possible worlds that God could have created. And of course, he's talking, very broadly, and he's talking mostly in terms of how God relates to humans, as far as what kind of world could God have created. First, he could have created a world of control, where God created us without the ability to do evil, with no opportunity to make real choices or face real consequences. He could have created a world of chaos, where we would have free will, but God never intervenes, which Brooks describes like this, quote, "An individual can do whatever he or she wants without consequence. Without any intervention at any time, it is truly the survival of the fittest. I don't think anyone would really want to live in a world where there is no hope for any help beyond human effort." What a telling quote that is. What he means is, he couldn't want to live in a world where there is no hope for any help beyond human effort. Which is too bad for him, since all evidence points to that being exactly the kind of world we live in. The bit about there being no consequences refers only to ultimate consequences. Actions have no consequences relative to God, who isn't there, or in this construction, might as well not be there. It doesn't intervene. He means eternal consequences. Well, in this chaotic world, aka the real world that we actually live in right now, there are still consequences to actions, both of the inevitable cause and effect variety and of the social variety. We construct our own morality, and we construct and impose the consequences for defying that morality. The lack of eternal consequences shouldn't bother us, because we had no good reason to expect that such things existed in the first place. Now, the third world that God could have created, and according to Brooks is the one that God actually did create, is the world of cooperation, where God created us with free will, but he also intervenes to guide and to help us. Brooks says, quote, "Option 3 seems to be the world God has created. There are real choices with real consequences for our actions. As I just said, life in the godless universe features real choices with real consequences. The fact that these consequences are not eternal doesn't make them unreal. This is, again, typical apologist thought. Things that don't last forever aren't treated as real or valuable. I find this to be a very childish, entitled way of looking at the world. And I also find it to be counterintuitive, since literally nothing, including apparently the universe itself, at least as we currently know it, is going to last forever. How is it sensible to view eternity as the standard for determining what is real or what is worth caring about? So why doesn't God just get rid of evil? I mean, isn't that the long-term plan anyway? If God's going to eradicate evil eventually, what is he waiting for? Well, Brooks has that covered too. First, God allowed the existence of evil so that we could understand good, in just the same way as we define hot and cold as being relative to each other. Now here Brooks takes another detour through the center of Crazy Town. Quote, "By creating beings that were spiritual and not physical, and giving them the right to choose as well, God gave the possibility for unseen evil beings to exist. Somehow these beings have the capacity to inflict harm as well as inject disease into the human condition. By allowing free will into the universe, God knew he would give these creatures the option to commit evil. But he prepared us with spiritual weapons, insight, and prayer to combat the evil. creating human beings with the capacity to commit evil is one thing, but why did God have to create the invisible beings again? I mean, was this an experiment? Did God create both corporeal and non-corporeal beings just to test which ones he liked more? The non-physical beings are apparently able to interact with the physical world. How else could they inflict harm and inject disease into us, whatever the fuck that means? So why were humans created with mortal physical bodies at all? Passages like this one only reveal how nonsensical and bonkers Brooks's version of Christianity actually is. Brooks says God defines evil, denounces evil, and will eventually destroy evil. Pandering alliteration, another apologetics trope that we have encountered. We also saw it earlier on with the control, chaos, cooperation labeling of the three possible worlds. Why create evil in the first place if God is only going to destroy it eventually? Apparently, in order to destroy evil, according to Brooks, God first had to create it or allow it to exist in the universe, so humans could have the ability to exercise their free will before God destroyed evil. Brooks says, quote, "By allowing evil a momentary presence in human existence, he not only defeated it on the cross, but also will ultimately remove it forever. Because of this, in eternity, we will be able to exist with our free wills intact without the presence of evil." Well, good luck making sense of Brooks's concept of evil after that. So, evil is the result of humans having free will and making decisions contrary to God's will and God's moral law. But there is also unseen evil that results from God creating invisible beings who also have free will. But by incarnating as Jesus and dying on the cross, God defeated evil. So when God ends the world at some point, no fewer than 2,000 years after he defeated evil on the cross, for some reason, he will remove evil forever. He will destroy it. Then we can live forever with free will and without evil, even though evil was previously established as the necessary result of free will. See, I think Brooks just opened a major hole in his solution to the problem of evil here. If his omnipotent God is able to remove evil from existence without removing free will, then it is possible for free will to exist without the possibility of evil. If it's possible for people to exist with free will, but without the possibility of evil, why didn't God simply create people and the universe to be that way in the first place? The potential for evil is a necessary condition for free will, as Brooks explicitly says throughout this chapter, or it isn't. Brooks reiterates this God allows it because we need it, but eventually we don't need it explanation of evil 2 more times in a pair of anecdotes, one of which, again, has him sitting next to an atheist on an airplane. Seriously, dude, take a fucking creative writing class. And then he finally brings this chapter to a close. Here's one last quote. Quote, "Yes, the world is filled with evil and suffering, but humans are the only creatures to realize this, and the only creatures capable of an intrinsically evil or good act. Man is moral, yet atheism cannot really explain why. Naturalism offers no help in answering the question of why evil exists outside of the belief that man, unlike other animals, simply has this inborn proclivity. Well, it's true, atheism can't explain why man is moral. Then again, atheism can't explain why bacon is so fucking delicious either, and we don't deduct points for that. Atheism is a state of belief or unbelief, depending on how you choose to express it, regarding a single proposition. Science, on the other hand, can explain why man is moral. Biology, sociology, anthropology, psychology, neurology, there are insights into the origins of our moral nature to be found in all of those fields. And humans may be the only creatures to have so sophisticated a moral sense, but we are not the only creatures that exhibit moral or proto-moral behavior. Chimpanzees, wolves, and ravens are just a few types of animals that have been observed displaying what may be moral characteristics. As for the question of why evil exists, I think the answer is simple. It's because we say it does. Evil, like good, is a human construct, and it is a very useful one. There are types of behavior that are beneficial, that feel good, that help both ourselves as individuals and our communities. We want to encourage these behaviors. We have labeled these behaviors good. At least in English, we have labeled them good. People who have other languages have other words for the exact same thing. There are other types of behavior that are detrimental, that cause pain, that damage both ourselves and our communities, that could even threaten our survival as a species if practiced too excessively. And we want to discourage these behaviors. We call them evil. We'll probably always disagree from time to time about which acts should qualify as evil. There's quite a bit of gray area between good and evil, and I would argue that most things fall between those two extremes, but it's important that those two extremes exist for the terms of defining the moral content, the moral quality, the moral character of certain acts. Of all acts, really. We'll always struggle with the moral questions that live in those gray areas. Some of the most difficult moral questions that we will ever have to struggle with are in those gray areas between those two poles. But the concept of evil really isn't that hard for me to define in a broad sense, because I'm not talking about anything magical, mystical, out there in the universe that I have to try and grasp. It's a human construct to describe the worst kinds of behavior, or the most vile, most morally reprehensible acts. And as for those detrimental, damaging behaviors that we call evil, why do we do those? Because though we're capable of compassion, we aren't always directed by it. Because though we're capable of reason, we don't always think or act reasonably. Because sometimes we're selfish, or short-sighted, or insensitive, or misguided, or jealous, or angry, or afraid, or cruel to each other. And sometimes we're even cruel to ourselves, as I'm demonstrating the further I get into this book. Well, anyway, that's it for this week. That's it for Chapter 3. I will be back in the next video in this series to respond to Chapter 4 of God's Not Dead, which is titled, There Was a Beginning. Sounds promising, doesn't it? Anyway, thank you guys as always for watching. Please leave a comment on this video. Agree, disagree, show me where I went wrong, show me where I could have made a point better, tell me what I got right. Encouragement, disagreement, critiquing, arguing, whatever. It means so much to me that you watch this and you enjoy it and it's of some use to you. So any response you would be compelled to leave would be welcome. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.